We've seen terrible episodes of nativism across American history, periods of intense violence and bigotry and exclusion. And what I'm trying to do is understand what are those conditions that produce nativism and how can we undo them? That just reproduces itself.
Columbia University professor Mae Ngai is one of America's leading historians of immigration. In the new collection, Immigration Matters: Movements, Visions, and Strategies for a Progressive Future, she advances a bold new theory to explain nativism, the virulent opposition to foreigners as dangers to the American way of life, however defined. Ngai begins by dispelling two prevalent myths.
Most people think nativism is a kind of human condition, that people are naturally suspicious of people who are different than they are. And I think that's wrong. It's ahistorical. I think if we think any bad idea is part of human nature, then we're doomed in terms of being able to change anything. So I think we have to look at nativism as a political project that's determined by history, by political conditions of time and place.
Ngai also overturns a theory most famously articulated by historian John Higham in 1955, that nativism arises during crises of confidence and periods of economic depression.
Actually, most upsurges of nativism in American history have been in times of economic expansion, but expansion of a certain kind. Nativism finds purchase when there's a big structural change in the economy, what economists call sectoral change, where the focus or the weight of economic production changes. So when these changes take place, some people are affected adversely, and other people have opportunities that didn't exist before. And it's this anxiety over uncertainty and precarity that drives nativism and scapegoating, not so much just general unemployment.
Ngai contends that nativism, from the 19th century to the 21st, arises from three dynamics: anxiety due to sectoral changes in the economy, like the shift from manufacturing to services, pundits and intellectuals who scapegoat immigrants, and politicians who weaponize difference for political gain. These dynamics can be seen in three major episodes when the U.S. imposed harsh immigration policies: the decades of Chinese exclusion, restrictions against Southern and Eastern Europeans that peaked in the 1920s, and the nativist upsurge that gave rise to Donald Trump.
The Chinese exclusion movement took place in the late 19th century during a time of westward expansion, right, but also the consolidation of a national market after the Civil War. So this led to a lot of different changes in the economy. And in the West Coast in particular, white workers had enjoyed high wages, in large part because California was isolated from the national market. It was a protected market, so wages were high. Prices were also high. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad around 1870, you had a lot of unintended consequences. You had a flooding of the Western markets with manufactured goods from the East, which drove down prices, drove down wages, and drove down the power of white skilled workers who had been organized, not so much in unions, but in guilds. And Chinese became the convenient other upon which to blame these changes. Chinese worked in manufacturing shoes and boots and cigars, and those are the two main areas where the power of skilled white workers had been eroded by this new economy. But they did not compete throughout the economy. It was in very particular sectors of the economy. But nativism drew on an older racism that had started in the gold fields, but was repurposed during the 1870s and 1880s, and that led to Chinese exclusion. I will add that Chinese exclusion, if we think about it as part of a national market, consolidation of a national market, we can also then think about it in relationship to the overturning of Reconstruction in the South and the advent of Jim Crow. And I think most tellingly, exclusion was passed by Congress because of an alliance between the West and the South. So this was a move by white supremacy to make sure that the new political economy and the new polity would remain under the control of whites.
Around the turn of the 20th century, the foreign-born population of the U.S. peaked at nearly 15%. It was a time of rapid industrialization and urbanization, and of vast structural shifts in the economy that kindled a fierce nativist reaction.
Skilled workers were finding their jobs de-skilled with the advent of mass production, and the nation needed tons and tons of unskilled labor to dig ditches for subways and build roads, work in the factories. So this was, again, a moment of change, and you had one sector of native-born workers, mostly white, who were de-skilled, and they weren't completely eliminated, but their power was vastly eroded. And so there you have, again, an interest, a grievance among a sector of the working class. And then you had racist theories promoted by eugenicists, Anglo-Saxonists, elite Boston Brahmins about the danger of cultural contamination from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. Interestingly, that movement against the so-called new immigrants from Europe took 20 years to succeed. There was a lot of debate and struggle over whether or not to restrict immigration from Europe in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And restrictionist bills faced 4 vetoes in Congress during those 20 years. And it was not till 1917, over Wilson's second veto, that a restrictionist bill was passed. And in our own time, since the late 20th century, you have another huge restructuring of the American economy. It's connected to globalization. And what we have here is the rise of the finance sector at the top end, a growth of the service sector, the low end, which uses a lot of immigrant labor, and a shrinking of the middle, a decrease in the number of manufacturing jobs, much of which is actually due to automation and the use of artificial intelligence and things like that, not immigration. You don't see Latinos getting jobs in the auto factories replacing white auto workers. No, you see them picking lettuce and working in meatpacking plants and things like that. So then we've had, since the 80s and 90s, a whole growth of think tanks and right-wing pundits talking about immigration, especially illegal immigration, which I believe is a proxy for Latino immigration. And then the politicians have run with that, notably Donald Trump. The reason I think it's so important to understand that nativism is not a human condition, but a political project, is that then we can see how to change it, how to challenge it. And in fact, the big movements of nativism have historically been challenged and resisted, and to some extent overcome. If you look at the restriction against European immigrants in World War I era up to 1924, by the time of World War II, a second and third generation of Euro-Americans had come of age and actually were important constituencies in the Democratic Party in the urban industrial North. And they were critical to a liberal coalition that not only overturned immigration restriction, or the national origins quotas in particular, but also were a force for a whole host of liberal issues, including civil rights. And today we have a generation of Latinos and Asian Americans, many of them second generation, some of them what we call 1.5. They came as children, as immigrants, but they basically grew up in the United States. And they are the activists pushing for immigration reform. They're the ones out in the streets. They're the ones who have been lobbying for 10 years or more. They're very sophisticated. They know strategy and tactics. They know how to organize mass demonstrations. They know how to talk to the media. And so I have a lot of faith in this generation of young people to carry this movement forward. And it's not going to be easy because The country is very divided. The majority of Americans do not want mass deportation of undocumented immigrants. That is consistently shown in the polls. Whether or not a majority of Americans can get behind a really comprehensive reform of our immigration policy, I think that remains to be seen. But I do think that you have now a whole generation of people who are under the age of 40, younger than me, who are leading this battle. And, I don't believe demography is destiny. You also need politics. But the fact that Latinos are now 19% of the population, half of the Latino population in the United States are citizens, and you have a whole generation of young people who are activists. And I think that you put all that together, and it gives us, I think, hope for a real change in this country.
You can read Mae Ngai's trenchant analysis of nativism and 15 other vitally important contributions in Immigration Matters: Movements, Visions, and Strategies for a Progressive Future, the perfect handbook for activists, scholars, policymakers, and anyone seeking solutions for one of the defining challenges of our time.